Throughout history, Africa has seen the emergence of some ruthless dictators, from Paul Biya of Cameroon, Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, and Denis Sassou Nguesso of Congo, just to mention a few. But none of these leaders come close to the leaders we shall be discussing in this video. The leaders we shall be discussing in this video took what it means to be a dictator to a whole different dimension. They were cruel, ruthless, and to a greater extent, psychotic. They eliminated people and ruined nations while glorifying themselves. Before we proceed, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notification so you don't miss any of our videos. So without any further delays, let's get started. 1. Idi Amin, Uganda. Idi Amin Dada, who ruled Uganda from 1971 to 1979, is widely regarded as one of the most violent and psychologically extreme dictators of the 20th century. His rule combined raw brutality, paranoia, delusions of grandeur, and theatrical madness, producing a reign of terror that scarred Uganda for generations. Before politics, Amin was a soldier and heavyweight boxing champion of Uganda, holding the national title for nearly a decade. He was physically imposing and relied heavily on brute force throughout his life. Some historians and medical observers have speculated, carefully, not diagnostically, that years of boxing, combined with possible untreated head trauma from boxing, may have worsened his impulsivity, aggression, and poor emotional control. However, it is important to state clearly, boxing alone does not explain Amin. His cruelty was also shaped by power, fear, insecurity, and a complete lack of restraint. Once in power, Amin became deeply paranoid. He believed enemies were everywhere, within the army, among ethnic groups, and even in his own inner circle. This paranoia led to mass purges, especially targeting the Akoli and Langi ethnic groups, whom he suspected of loyalty to former President Milton Obote. Soldiers were arrested at random, tortured, and executed without trial. Amin never slept in the same house for days in a row. He would constantly move from house to confuse his enemies. One of the most disturbing aspects of Amin's rule was his personal involvement in torture and killing. Survivors and former officials reported that Amin frequently visited torture chambers, particularly at Makindye Military Prison and the State Research Bureau. Prisoners were beaten with hammers, electrocuted, drowned, mutilated, or left to starve. Some were forced to dig their own graves. Bodies were dumped into the Nile, earning it the grim nickname, the River of Death. Amin's behavior often crossed into grotesque spectacle. He reportedly kept heads of political enemies in refrigerators, claiming they helped him think clearly. Amin would laugh while describing executions and treated death as entertainment. He forced relatives of victims to pay for the bullets used to kill their loved ones, a calculated act of psychological cruelty. His delusions of grandeur were equally extreme. Amin gave himself absurd titles such as His Excellency, President for Life, Field Marshal Al-Haji, Dr. Idi Amin Dada, VC, DSO, MC, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the sea. He claimed to have defeated the British Empire and declared himself King of Scotland. He wrote bizarre letters to world leaders, including threatening or mocking messages to Queen Elizabeth II and US presidents. In 1972, Amin expelled around 80,000 Asians from Uganda, accusing them of economic sabotage. Their businesses were handed to unqualified loyalists, collapsing the economy almost overnight. This act was driven by xenophobia, greed, and Amin's belief that he was carrying out divine orders. One day, Amin announced on national radio that he was divorcing 3 of his wives all at once, an act which proved he had no control of his emotions and acted on a whim. He reported had about 5 wives and multiple concubines, and he fathered many children. When he attacked Tanzania, he invited the then president of Tanzania for a boxing match, stating that he would destroy Julius Nyerere in seconds. This guy was indeed insane. By the end of his rule, an estimated 300,000 to 500,000 people had been killed. Uganda's institutions were destroyed, its economy shattered, and fear became the foundation of daily life. Idi Amin was not merely a dictator who committed atrocities. He ruled through chaos, terror, and personal cruelty, embodying how absolute power can unleash the darkest impulses of a human being. When he was removed, he fled to Libya and found refuge under his friends Muammar Gaddafi. Now let's talk about Gaddafi, shall we? 2. Muammar Gaddafi, Libya. Muammar Gaddafi, who ruled Libya from 1969 to 2011, was one of the most eccentric, authoritarian, and psychologically complex leaders of the modern era. His reign blended brutal repression, revolutionary theatrics, personal obsessions, and grand delusions, making him both feared and endlessly fascinating. Gaddafi was not psychotic in a clinical sense, but his behavior displayed extreme narcissism, paranoia, obsession with control, and a cultivated aura of mysticism and excess. Gaddafi seized power at just 27 years old in a bloodless military coup that overthrew Libya's monarchy. Initially, many Libyans welcomed him. He nationalized oil, expelled foreign military bases, and promoted Arab nationalism. He was praised and adored for that, but very quickly, power became personalized. Gaddafi dismantled formal state institutions and replaced them with his own ideology, outlined in his bizarre manifesto, the Green Book, which he claimed was superior to capitalism and communism. In reality, it gave him absolute authority while pretending Libya was ruled by the people. His rule was brutal and unforgiving. Political dissent was crushed ruthlessly. Opponents were imprisoned, tortured, or publicly executed. In the 1970s and 1980s, executions were broadcast on television to terrify the population. Libyan dissidents abroad were hunted down by assassination squads known as stray dogs, killed in Europe and the Middle East. Fear was not a byproduct of Gaddafi's rule, it was a deliberate tool. Gaddafi developed an intense cult of personality. His portraits filled streets, schools, and offices. He saw himself as a philosopher king, revolutionary prophet, and destined leader of Africa and the Arab world. Over time, his ambitions expanded from Libya to continental dominance. He poured billions into African liberation movements, funded coups, armed rebels, and attempted to position himself as King of Kings of Africa. This thirst for influence was driven less by ideology and more by his obsession with legacy and power. One of the most disturbing aspects of Gaddafi's rule was his relationship with women. He surrounded himself with an elite unit of all-female bodyguards, known as the Amazonian Guard, whom he claimed symbolized gender equality. However, numerous former insiders and human rights reports alleged that Gaddafi sexually abused and coerced women, including aides and captives. These women reportedly lived under strict control, unable to refuse him. While Gaddafi publicly presented himself as a moral revolutionary, privately he exercised absolute dominance over women around him. His personal obsessions extended into the absurd. Gaddafi had a well-documented fixation on US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, whom he reportedly admired intensely. He kept a photo album of her and once allegedly refused to sleep after meetings involving her, insisting on replaying recordings of her speeches. While Rice dismissed this as uncomfortable and inappropriate, it reinforced Gaddafi's reputation for boundary-less obsession. Gaddafi was literally obsessed with Condoleezza Rice, and even commissioned an artist to compose songs about her. In 2009, during a visit to Italy, Gaddafi reportedly invited hundreds of young women, many described as models or students, to attend lectures at his residence, where he attempted to persuade them to convert to Islam, offering money and gifts. These events, while framed as religious outreach, were widely criticized as manipulative and self-serving spectacles. Gaddafi also loved theater and spectacle. He invited world-famous musicians such as Beyoncé, Mariah Carey, Usher, Lionel Richie, and Nelly Furtado to perform at lavish private events, often paying millions. While ordinary Libyans lived under oppression, Gaddafi indulged in luxury tents, gold-plated weapons, exotic cars, and extravagant ceremonies meant to reinforce his myth. It was reported that superstar artist Usher was invited by Gaddafi just to do a countdown to midnight. Despite his wealth and control, paranoia consumed him. He constantly changed sleeping locations, relied on loyal tribes, and feared betrayal. This paranoia intensified during the Arab Spring in 2011, when protests erupted across Libya. Gaddafi responded with extreme violence, ordering forces to fire on civilians and vowing to hunt opponents house to house. The crackdown triggered NATO intervention, justified as a mission to protect civilians. As rebel forces advanced, Gaddafi's regime collapsed rapidly. In October 2011, while fleeing his hometown of Sirte, Gaddafi was captured by rebel fighters, beaten, humiliated, and filmed. He was killed under chaotic circumstances, bringing an abrupt and brutal end to his 42-year rule. Muammar Gaddafi's legacy is one of contradiction: revolutionary and tyrant, nationalist and narcissist, anti-imperialist and absolute ruler. While some people loved and adored him, he was a nightmare to others. 3. Jean-Bedel Bokassa, Central African Republic. Jean-Bedel Bokassa, ruler of the Central African Republic from 1966 to 1979, is one of the most extreme examples of how absolute power can descend into madness, cruelty, and grotesque self-worship. While not psychotic in a medical sense, Bokassa's behavior showed severe delusions of grandeur, impulsive violence, obsession with domination, and theatrical excess that shocked even other dictators. Bokassa came to power through a military coup on January 1, 1966, overthrowing his cousin, President David Dacko. A former French colonial army officer, Bokassa had served in Indochina, Vietnam, and France, where he absorbed military discipline and a deep admiration for European imperial grandeur. Once in power, he initially promised order and stability. Within a few years, however, the state became an extension of his personality. His self-aggrandizement knew no limits. In 1976, Bokassa declared himself Emperor Bokassa I, transforming the republic into the Central African Empire. He became obsessively fixated on Napoleon Bonaparte, seeing himself as Africa's imperial counterpart. Bokassa believed history had destined him for greatness and that he was misunderstood, just like Napoleon. This obsession culminated in one of the most obscene spectacles of the 20th century. In December 1977, Bokassa staged a coronation deliberately modeled on Napoleon's 1804 ceremony. He wore a diamond-encrusted crown, a velvet robe trimmed with ermine, and sat on a golden throne shaped like an eagle. The event reportedly cost over $100 million, nearly one-third of the country's annual budget. Meanwhile, the Central African population suffered from hunger, collapsing infrastructure, unpaid civil servants, and failing schools. Bokassa seemed entirely detached from reality, convinced that pageantry equaled legitimacy. His obsession with women was equally extreme. Bokassa had dozens of wives, many taken by force, and was notorious for sexual violence. Girls, some reportedly underage, were brought to the palace. Refusal was not an option. Former associates described a ruler who viewed women as property, trophies meant to affirm his power. During his military service in Vietnam, Bokassa fathered several children, later referred to as his Vietnamese children. After becoming emperor, he reportedly brought some of them to the Central African Empire, using them to reinforce his self-image as a global conqueror, whose legacy stretched beyond Africa. These children symbolized his belief that his bloodline was destined to rule. Bokassa's rule was brutal and sadistic. He personally beat prisoners, ordered executions, and ruled by terror. The most infamous incident occurred in 1979, when he ordered the arrest of school children protesting the cost of mandatory uniforms produced by a company linked to one of his wives. Dozens, possibly over 100, children were beaten to death or killed in prison. Witnesses later claimed Bokassa himself participated in the violence. There were also credible allegations of cannibalism. Former palace staff testified that Bokassa kept human flesh in freezers and claimed that consuming enemies gave him power. While sensational, these accusations were taken seriously during his later trial and remain part of his horrifying legacy. France, which had long supported Bokassa for strategic reasons, finally withdrew its backing after the massacre of school children. In September 1979, while Bokassa was abroad, French paratroopers launched Operation Barracuda, removing him from power and restoring David Dacko as president. Bokassa fled into exile, later returned, and was eventually tried. He was sentenced to death, later commuted to life imprisonment, and eventually released. Jean-Bedel Bokassa's story is not just about cruelty. It is a warning about unchecked ego, delusion, and the corrosion of humanity by absolute power. His reign remains one of Africa's darkest and most grotesque chapters. 4. Mobutu Sese Seko, Zaire, DRC. Mobutu Sese Seko, who ruled Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, from 1965 to 1997, is remembered as one of the most extreme examples of authoritarian rule in Africa, blending narcissism, paranoia, kleptocracy, and theatrical governance. During his reign, his behavior exhibited clear patterns of delusions of grandeur, obsession with control, erratic policy making, and detachment from reality. Mobutu seized power in 1965 through a military coup, overthrowing President Joseph Kasavubu. A former Belgian colonial officer and army officer during the Congo crisis, he consolidated authority quickly, transforming the state into a personal empire where his word was law and all institutions served his ego. From the outset, he demonstrated extreme tendencies that would define his decades-long rule. One of the most obvious signs of Mobutu's psychological extremity was his cult of personality. Statues, portraits, propaganda songs, and public rituals glorified him constantly. Citizens were required to praise him in public, and dissent was treated as treason. This obsession with self-glorification and symbolic domination was a recurring feature of his rule. Mobutu's paranoia was extreme. He distrusted everyone, rotating generals and ministers frequently to prevent conspiracies. He created extensive intelligence networks, including secret police, to monitor political rivals, regional leaders, and even family members. Promotions and dismissals were based entirely on loyalty rather than competence, creating instability in government and the army. This obsessive need for control often caused erratic decision-making and internal purges that weakened the state. The scale of embezzlement and greed under Mobutu was staggering. Over 3 decades, he stole billions of dollars from the national treasury, funneling wealth into Swiss accounts, private estates, and luxury goods, while the majority of Zairians lived in extreme poverty. His policies favored cronies and personal enrichment over public welfare. National industries collapsed due to mismanagement, civil servants went unpaid, and basic infrastructure crumbled. By the 1980s, Zaire's economy was on the verge of total collapse. Mobutu's absurd laws and public theatrics further illustrate his detachment from reality. The Authenticité campaign forced citizens to adopt traditional customs, clothing, and names, but applied selectively to enhance his image. Cities, streets, and even currency designs celebrated him personally. While framed as nationalism, these measures served primarily to reinforce his ego and sense of historical importance. Extravagance was central to Mobutu's rule. He lived in palaces with gold-plated fittings, private airstrips, a personal zoo, and luxury vehicles, while ordinary Zairians faced famine and unemployment. He spent billions on lavish state ceremonies, celebrating himself, demonstrating a psychological disconnect from the realities of governance. Finally, Mobutu exploited Cold War politics to his advantage, securing Western aid to maintain power. This survival instinct, combined with erratic, impulsive governance and a reliance on fear and bribery, exemplifies his unbalanced approach to leadership. By the time he was removed in 1997 by rebel forces led by Laurent Désiré Kabila, Zaire was a collapsed state, with shattered institutions, widespread corruption, and a population living in chronic poverty. Mobutu's rule stands as a testament to how unchecked narcissism, paranoia, greed, and obsession with control can devastate a nation, leaving a legacy of chaos long after the ruler is gone. 5. Macías Nguema, Equatorial Guinea. Francisco Macías Nguema, often remembered as Africa's most mentally unstable ruler, led Equatorial Guinea from 1968 to 1979 and presided over one of the most terrifying and destructive regimes in modern African history. His rule combined paranoia, extreme brutality, delusions of divinity, and the systematic dismantling of state institutions, leaving his country in a state of chaos and fear. Macías Nguema became president in 1968 following Equatorial Guinea's independence from Spain. Initially, he was a relatively obscure political figure from the Fang ethnic group, but his rise coincided with the post-colonial power vacuum. Once in office, Nguema quickly centralized power around himself, declaring that he alone was capable of leading the nation. Within a few years, his paranoia, superstition, and cruelty transformed the country into a personal dictatorship. One of the most infamous aspects of Nguema's reign was his outlawing of education and suppression of knowledge. Schools were closed or severely restricted, libraries were burned, and intellectuals were systematically hunted down. Anyone perceived as educated or capable of challenging his authority was at risk. Professors, teachers, and civil servants were executed, tortured, or forced into exile. This attack on intellectuals decimated the country's human capital, leaving generations uneducated and contributing to the long-term instability of Equatorial Guinea. Nguema also banned Christianity, the faith of the majority of the population. He viewed religion as a rival source of authority and attempted to replace it with a quasi-religious cult centered on his own personality. Nguema declared himself a god, claiming divine status and expecting absolute obedience from the populace. He forced citizens to perform elaborate public displays of loyalty, and failure to demonstrate devotion could result in imprisonment or execution. This religious delusion further fueled his paranoia and authoritarian control. Macías Nguema's paranoia extended into mundane aspects of daily life. He reportedly believed that radios, telegraphs, and even household appliances were tools for spying on him. He kept government funds under his bed, distrusting banks and any formal financial system. His policies were impulsive, arbitrary, and often cruelly symbolic, executing entire families, targeting specific ethnic groups, and punishing perceived enemies without trial. Mass killings, beatings, and disappearances became routine. It is estimated that at least 1/3 of Equatorial Guinea's population either fled or died during his decade-long rule, creating a refugee crisis and leaving communities decimated. Nguema's government was marked by complete isolation and economic collapse. Trade diminished, infrastructure deteriorated, and foreign relations were erratic. His obsession with control and fear of conspiracy prevented any meaningful governance. Even within his inner circle, loyalty was enforced through terror. Ministers, generals, and close aides were often executed on suspicion of disloyalty. The country effectively became a state of fear, with Nguema's personality cult dominating every aspect of life. By the late 1970s, opposition within the government grew. Nguema had alienated nearly every faction, including relatives and top military leaders. In August 1979, a coup led by his nephew, Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo, succeeded in overthrowing him while he was away from the capital. Nguema attempted to flee, but was captured, tried, and executed. His removal ended the most destructive and chaotic period in Equatorial Guinea's history, leaving a country traumatized by fear, emigration, and economic ruin. Francisco Macías Nguema's rule serves as a stark example of how absolute power, combined with delusion, paranoia, and extreme cruelty, can devastate a nation. His legacy is one of terror, cultural destruction, and a reminder of the dangers posed by leaders whose personal obsessions dictate national policy rather than reason or law. 6. Yahya Jammeh, the Gambia. Yahya Jammeh, who ruled the Gambia from 1994 to 2017, is remembered as a highly authoritarian, erratic, and delusional leader whose behavior inflicted long-term trauma on his country. Jammeh's rule was marked by human rights abuses, political repression, bizarre public claims, and widespread corruption, earning him a reputation as one of West Africa's most unpredictable and psychologically extreme leaders. Jammeh seized power in a bloodless military coup in 1994, overthrowing President Dawda Jawara. Initially, many Gambians welcomed the coup, hoping for reform and anti-corruption measures. However, Jammeh quickly revealed his paranoia and thirst for absolute control, dismantling democratic institutions and concentrating power entirely in his hands. Opposition leaders, journalists, and civil society figures were harassed, imprisoned, tortured, or killed, creating an atmosphere of constant fear. Torture methods reportedly included beatings, electric shocks, and confinement in secret detention centers, while many detainees were executed without trial. One of the most notorious aspects of Jammeh's rule was his alleged sexual abuse of women. Several former victims and human rights organizations reported rape and sexual coercion by Jammeh, often targeting women who worked closely with the state or were perceived as threats. These allegations added to his image as a ruler who viewed citizens, especially women, as objects to control and exploit. Jammeh was also infamous for his delusional public statements, often claiming miraculous powers. He boasted that he could cure AIDS and other diseases with herbal remedies, despite no scientific basis. The medications he promoted were widely regarded as fake and ineffective, yet he forced state hospitals to distribute them, undermining public health and risking countless lives. He also made threats against journalists and political opponents in the name of his supposed supernatural abilities, blending superstition with state terror. Under Jammeh, corruption and mismanagement crippled the Gambia's institutions. He funneled state resources into personal projects, military loyalty programs, and lavish displays of power, leaving the economy weak and public services inadequate. His paranoia extended to routine governance. Ministers were frequently dismissed or arrested on suspicion of disloyalty, and policies were often enacted impulsively, with little regard for their effect on citizens. His delusional and psychotic tendencies became especially evident in the final years of his rule, when he refused to accept his defeat in the 2016 election against Adama Barrow. Jammeh initially conceded, then recanted, claiming foreign conspiracies and supernatural support. This brinkmanship pushed the Gambia to the verge of civil conflict and required intervention by ECOWAS forces to enforce the democratic transition. Jammeh's legacy is one of fear, trauma, and institutional weakness. His delusional behavior, believing in supernatural powers, enforcing arbitrary punishments, distributing fake medicines, and exploiting citizens, combined with systematic human rights abuses, left the Gambia struggling to rebuild democratic institutions and public trust. Decades of repression, intimidation, and personal whim had a profound and lasting effect on the country's social, political, and economic development. 7. Queen Ranavalona I of Madagascar. Queen Ranavalona I of Madagascar, often called Ranavalona the Mad by European observers, ruled from 1828 to 1861 and is remembered as one of the most ruthless and paranoid monarchs in African history. Her reign was characterized by extreme authoritarianism, violent purges, obsessive suspicion of foreign influence, and draconian laws, which earned her a reputation for cruelty and instability. While the label "mad" reflects European perspectives and exaggeration, historical accounts confirm that her behavior was highly erratic and often brutally oppressive. Ranavalona ascended the throne after the death of her husband, King Radama I, and quickly moved to consolidate power. She was fiercely protective of Madagascar's sovereignty and deeply suspicious of European colonial intentions. This suspicion manifested in extreme measures against foreigners, especially missionaries, traders, and diplomats. She expelled Christian missionaries, outlawed Christianity, and persecuted converts, forcing Malagasy Christians to renounce their faith or face imprisonment, torture, or execution. Entire communities were affected, with widespread destruction of churches and European cultural influence. Her paranoia extended to her own court and subjects. Ranavalona is infamous for the Tangina ordeal, a poison trial used to root out disloyalty. Suspected traitors, nobles, or anyone who displeased her were forced to ingest Tangina poison, often resulting in excruciating death. This method of control reinforced fear throughout the kingdom and demonstrated her reliance on violent, ritualized punishment to maintain authority. Scholars estimate that tens of thousands of people died from these ordeals, making her rule one of the bloodiest in Madagascar's history. Ranavalona also imposed harsh social policies, including forced labor and conscription. Citizens were compelled to work on massive infrastructure projects, cultivate crops for the crown, and participate in military campaigns. Failure to comply could result in severe punishment or execution. Her governance style was authoritarian to the extreme. Disobedience or even perceived disrespect could be fatal, creating a climate of terror across the island. Despite her brutality, Ranavalona was highly effective at preserving Madagascar's independence during a period when European colonial powers were expanding aggressively across Africa. Her resistance to French and British influence delayed colonization, and she maintained a strict policy of isolationism, controlling trade and diplomacy carefully. Ranavalona's reign ended in 1861 with her death at the age of 72. She was succeeded by her son, Radama II, who immediately reversed many of her policies, welcoming Europeans, legalizing Christianity, and relaxing harsh laws. While European observers labeled her mad, modern historians argue that her cruelty was intertwined with her obsessive desire to protect Madagascar's sovereignty and culture from colonial domination. In summary, Queen Ranavalona I combined paranoia, ritualized violence, and extreme authoritarianism to maintain power for over 3 decades. Her methods, poison trials, mass executions, and suppression of foreign influence shocked contemporaries and earned her enduring infamy. While her reign preserved Madagascar's independence, it did so at an enormous human cost, leaving her legacy as one of Africa's most fearsome and psychotically rigid monarchs.